Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research. My name is Henry Smith. Today, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston of the Christian Thinkers Society joins us here in the studio as we discuss the most studied artifact in history, the Shroud of Turin. Jeremiah, it's great to have you on Digging for Truth.
Henry, I'm a big fan of yours. Thank you for having me on the program. I benefit so much from your scholarship and your wisdom. Thank you for all you do for this program. I'm excited. We have breaking news about the Shroud of Turin, so I'm excited to get into it with you.
Well, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a while, so I guess we're having a mutual admiration society here to start out. Huh? But in all seriousness, I'm really thankful that you're here. We're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin. Yes. And that might put up some barriers in people's minds immediately. Mm-hmm. In fact, it put some barriers up in your mind. Maybe you could start by telling us your impressions of the Shroud of Turin before a couple of years ago.
Well, and shame on me, I was conditioned because I went a non-confessional route. That means that I went to a secular place to do my PhD. Because part of my calling was to have the same educational credentials that many of the hyper-skeptics have while being iron-fisted for Jesus Christ underneath it all. And so I moved to Oxford in 2009. Okay. I completed a 93,000-word Überlieferungsgeschichte, a history of resurrection belief in the Judeo-Christian motif.
Okay.
I published that in a Bloomsbury T&T Clark monograph series. So my PhD is on the historical Jesus, primarily in the realm of the evidence for the physical bodily resurrection of Christ. Therefore, I was conditioned to always follow the evidence. And so I've been very happy and blessed by the Lord to publish a lot, both in the scholarly and in the popular world on the resurrection of Jesus. And I have been doing so many programs over the last few years where this question about the Shroud of Turin kept bubbling up. And I would always just play it off and be like, oh, I follow the evidence. And a very highbrow answer. And I don't think there's any evidence until, guess what? I was challenged by my pastor, Dr. Jack Graham. Hey, Jeremiah, you need to give the Shroud another look. Have you actually read the evidence, or are you just reading what other thinkers have said about it? And Henry, I'd never looked at the evidence for the Shroud of Turin. I'd never read the primary research material, the research data. And just like you, I'm a seeker of truth. I'm addicted to seeking truth. The most dangerous place our audience can get is when you stop seeking truth.
Yeah.
And so I came to the place in my scholarship after actually reading the evidence for myself to become an ardent defender of the Shroud of Turin. I believe it's a slam dunk that the Shroud of Turin is indeed the burial cloth of Jesus. And the implications are enormous if that's true.
Yeah. Well, that's great. You come right out of the gate.
Full circle.
Tell them up front. Sometimes you build an argument up. Sometimes you tell them and then you show, right? So it's interesting, though, how we can sometimes absorb sort of ideas or maybe paradigms, I call them sometimes. And if we just don't take the moment to, it's not that you're not a truth seeker, but it was just a little blind spot, right? That you missed, and then finally it came around. It's so interesting that can happen. So I guess the Shroud had been slandered pretty badly.
Absolutely, it is.
So you kind of just put it off.
Yeah,
we're going to cover
it. I just avoided
those.
it, and now I'm benefiting so much from actually looking into the research. And I believe people, if you look at it with an open mind, as I did, the evidence speaks for itself.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, over the next two episodes, we're gonna do that. We're gonna explore probably big 5 categories, what you call astonishing reasons you believe the Shroud is authentic. So before we get into those, maybe for someone who's completely new to the Shroud, there might be some folks that don't know anything about it. Maybe you can give just a tutorial, just a brief overview of it.
One of the big questions, and I have so much fun with this on media programs. I mean, we're really asking, Henry, did God take the first selfie? Did Jesus take the first selfie? Was this a 2,000-year-old photograph? Because the Shroud of Turin is fascinating because we have the image of a crucified man at a molecular level embedded into a linen burial wrap. That's what the Shroud is. And in fact, Midjourney AI out of the UK recently took the data, and all AI is machine learning, and it took just data from the Shroud of Turin recently, and it produced an image that you're seeing on the screen of what the man who's crucified in the shroud would look like based on Midjourney AI. I think this picture is captivating.
Yeah, it is remarkable. So now this new technology can aid what's already been done in the scientific studies. So one of the things that you mentioned is this isn't an object that's been isolated and only studied by a couple of people, or like the Ethiopian church, for example, says they have the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes.
But they never produce it. No one ever gets to see it.
No, yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned is the cross-disciplinary nature of the study of it. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. This is something that I find very compelling. This is something that no one argues about either. The Shroud of Turin is the most studied archaeological artifact in the world. There's not a close second. I'm talking about over 100 cross-disciplinary scholars have done primary research on the Shroud of Turin and published their research in respected scientific academic journals. Henry, I'm not talking about a bunch of preachers or theologians or New Testament scholars. I'm talking about weapons scientists from Sandia Labs in New Mexico. I'm talking about Air Force professors from the Air Force Academy. I'm talking about photo scholars as well, those that are scholars in light, how images develop, medical experts, medical doctors. It is the most cross-disciplinary studied artifact. It's the most studied artifact of all time. And so that's compelling to me. And so when I look at the research, I see there wasn't some conspiracy or bias of a bunch of people that came together saying, hey, we have to prove the Shroud is true. And in fact, in the STIRP project, 1978, the Shroud is approved to be studied. I'm showing images right now of that original team, 50 scholars from around the world. They came together over a weekend. And by the way, the Shroud is not always on display. Right now, you can go to Turin, Italy, in the Piedmont district of northern Italy, and you can see a facsimile. I'm told on good authority that for the Jubilee year, next year, 2025, the Shroud will indeed be put on display again. But these scientists are gathering, and they have this amazing 60 or so hours with the Shroud where they're able to do their primary research. And I've interviewed many of the group, the original Shroud of Research team, the STIRP team. And they said, we met in Italy. We were having drinks in the lobby thinking, wow, we just got a free trip to Italy because we just know this Shroud is a hoax. A day later, after they conducted their research, 24 hours in, no one was laughing, Henry, because they said, we don't know what we have here, but there's something. It's not a hoax.
Yeah, it's not a hoax. And we're talking about people so one of the ways that you can kind of diffuse too much of an influence of worldview in this is having a diversity of worldview in the scientific analysis.
Absolutely.
Is a point that you've made. It's not Roman Catholic or Protestant or even Orthodox Jewish, or I would say Messianic Jewish, I guess, but a whole variety of people.
And I would say this. I would say the overwhelming worldview was that it was a hoax, and these scientists thought they just had a free trip to Italy on the Catholic Church.
And getting paid to do it.
They were going to be able to disprove it in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, what we're going to do now is go to a break, Jeremiah, and then we'll come back.
Started.
We're just getting the wheels turning. So, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back after this break. Are you interested in digging even deeper for the truth? Then please visit the ABR website at BibleArchaeology.org and click on Bookstore. There you'll find a wide variety of resources designed to defend the Christian faith. Archaeology, apologetics, the text of Scripture, creation evolution, even study Bibles. You can pick up the perfect gift for the sincere seeker or fellow Christian. Visit Bible Archaeology and click on Bookstore today. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so you came out of the gates here telling us, you're convinced that this is the real deal. Now we're gonna walk through all that. You've done some of that already about the cross-disciplinary nature of the studies. Let's talk about just a brief moment about. My impression always was that this had been in the possession of the Catholic Church for a long time. I was mistaken about that. Just tell us about that, because that kind of gets people to dismiss it sometimes, unfairly.
It's a fact that many Protestants believe that the Shroud of Turin is just a, quote, another Catholic relic. And I was conditioned to believe that as a Protestant as well, Henry, until I actually, again, did the research. And the Shroud of Turin has not been in the hands of the Catholic Church It's only happened since 1988. So the entire history of the Shroud of Turin antedates the possession of the Catholic Church. In fact, it's not even really the Catholic Church. The Turin Shroud is now the possession. It's the custodial of it is the Pope himself, not even the Catholic Church. So there's an important distinction there. So not until 1988 did the Pope become the custodian of the Shroud of Turin. It was held in private family hands until then. I think that's an important point for our audience.
Yeah, and it shows us too, like, we obviously, Protestants have differences theologically with people with the Catholic doctrine. The point is not being, just making assumptions. We can assume things that are not necessarily true. We should, test everything, hold on to the good, right?
Yeah,
and that's a bit unfair to our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church.
It is, and when you think about, the largest landowners on earth are the Catholic Church, and so if we do archaeology seriously, we're going to bump into the Catholic Church again and again and again. So even if it was held in the Catholic hands, again, I can't allow that to stop me from seeking truth. The Vatican Library is one of my favorite libraries in the entire world. They have a treasure trove of incredible artifacts for Bible manuscripts. I don't allow that to be a partition in my mind to seeking truth.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so when we're thinking about the shroud itself, maybe talk a little bit about that. And you have this Egyptian parallel as far as preservation goes. Tell us about that.
If a lot of people are watching, you're like my teenage daughter. What is a shroud, Dad? Like, wait a minute, what you keep using this word shroud? Well, the word shroud shows up in all four Gospels. It is the cloth that Jesus' body was buried in. According to the Mishnah, if the Sanhedrin sentenced a criminal to death by Roman approval, it was on the Sanhedrin to take care of the burial of that criminal. What do we see playing out in the juridical procedure in the Gospels as it relates to Jesus? We see two members of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, asking Pilate for the body of Jesus. And then the eyewitness narrative embedded in the Gospels tells us, Henry, that Jesus' body was wrapped in a shroud. There's that word, a linen shroud. What do we have from antiquity? We actually have hundreds of burial shrouds from the land of Israel. And you might say, if you're skeptical, Jeremiah, are you telling me that a burial shroud has survived 2,000 years? Yes, that's exactly what the evidence is telling us, but we can do so much better. There is something called the Tarkan dress that our audience is seeing right now. This is a linen shirt. It's quite old. In fact, it's 3,000 years older than the Shroud of Turin. You're looking at a 5,000-year-old shirt. This was found in Egypt. It's dated to 3200 BC.
Yeah.
And so, friends, what I want you to know is it's no big deal that a shroud or a linen garment survives for thousands of years. The Shroud of Turin that we have extant is about 14 feet long and it's about 4 feet wide. Enough to where, if I can borrow this piece of paper, Henry, Jesus' body, almost like a pita, is placed head first into the shroud. It covers the top of his head, then down to his feet. That's what the shroud does. That's why it's 14 feet long. Another compelling bit of evidence is the crucified man in the shroud is not as short as what you would guess. He's actually somewhere in the neighborhood of 5'10" to 6 feet tall, which is fascinating and tells us a lot about the antiquity of those crucified in the time of Jesus.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Can't get away from the size of it. It is what it is, right? The imprint there, so has to be studied on those terms. So one of the that's all phenomenal, and in fact, the shroud has been deliberately preserved because obviously it's connected back and it's been kept. So that other one that you showed, the Egyptian one, was not being deliberately preserved.
It wasn't venerated.
And yet that's still double the time.
Exactly.
So the fact that it could be kept, there we have a parallel. We call those parallels sometimes.
Absolutely.
Here it is. So one of the ways that we kind of think about evaluating evidence, we use a principle sometimes called Occam's razor, right? So one of the ways that you've looked at this is to say, well, okay, let's say for a second we don't know exactly what it is, but scientists have really determined a lot of what it isn't.
Right.
And so that's an important consideration. So maybe talk about that, like, the pigments, coloring, those kind of questions that people inevitably
Absolutely.
have.
This is another astonishing reason why I believe the Shroud of Turin is authentic and likely the burial shroud of Jesus is that scientists, the best scientists today, I'm talking about rocket science, cannot explain how there is an image, a molecular image embedded in the cloth. This is what's fascinating about the shroud. The best scientists of our day simply cannot explain how there's an image. When you go to the Shroud of Research website and you look at their primary research that took 2 to 3 years to publish. Remember, the goal of archaeology, as we say here on Digging for Truth, is publication, not excavation.
That's exactly
right. It took
right.
about 3 years for the findings to be published. And in the early 80s, the 50 scientists who we've already mentioned, who had that time with the shroud, came out and they said, there is no pigment, there is no dye, there's no paint. We cannot explain how the image is there. Now, the shroud is full of blood. There is all kinds of blood all over the shroud, and that blood seeps through all the way because obviously a dead, crucified man was placed in the shroud, so there's blood all over it. And why am I bringing that up? Well, the image is only superficial, whereas the blood drains all the way through that herringbone weave of the Shroud of Turin. The image is just a few fibers thick, if I could even use that word.
So it doesn't go all the way through.
It doesn't penetrate all the way
does.
through. It is a superficial, so it comes after the blood. That's my point.
Yeah.
The image comes, the blood is there first, the death is there first, and then the image appears. And scientists still today now, 40 years later, can't explain how the image is there.
Yeah, so the scientists are able to actually see that when they
Right.
when they look at that herringbone weave.
Exactly.
Whereas maybe a century ago we wouldn't have been able to.
No, with microscopes and the best
all of that
photo documentation, talking to Barry Schwartz, and I have pictures that we can look at that show that it's just a few fibers into each thread, the image, which is just fantastic to think about. We have an image right now of one of those documenting photographers looking through the electron microscope at the herringbone weave of the actual Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, it's fantastic. All right, well, believe it or not, we're finished this segment. We're going to have to go
way
to a
too
break.
fast.
That's all right. Well, we got plenty of time. Remember, folks, we're not only doing this episode with Dr. Johnston, but we are going to have a second episode. We're going to develop this for you. Please don't go away. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures for students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston of the Christian Thinkers Society, and we're thinking through the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so really fascinating in this last segment. I've learned, I knew about this. We've had a guest on before, John Long, who does a wonderful job of laying out some of the evidence, but you bring a lot of stuff that I didn't know about, particularly the way the image does not go all the way through the thread.
Right.
Maybe John told me that and I just didn't remember, but really important consideration. And so this is tied into the shroud was damaged sometime in the medieval period, right? Fire, water. Talk about that and the implications for those incidents.
Absolutely. We have to get back to your Occam's razor analogy. If this was a hoax of the Middle Ages, as many purport based on very little evidence, well, it has survived several fires, at least 3 fires that we know of. So you imagine the carbon damage, the smoke damage, that if it was some kind of painted, smudged image, it would have diminished. And then the shroud, obviously, to survive the flames, was doused in water. I mean, literally doused in water.
To put it out,
it would have washed away the image, and yet it hasn't been washed away. So this is what a Yale professor said, the physics don't make sense of the chemistry of the shroud, and the chemistry doesn't make sense of the physics.
Interesting.
It's otherworldly. And again, all I'm trying to do is follow the evidence where it leads. I respect these scientists. I respect these scholars. I respect these medical professionals. And, when you look at just the pollen nature of the shroud, can we talk about the pollen on the shroud?
If you want to talk about it, let's do it.
One scholar gave 5 years of his life to go around and get pollen samples, comparing that with the pollen we have on the shroud. And the pollen spores that are on the shroud originate from one part, the Holy Land, the land of Israel. So again, if you and I are coming up with a medieval forgery and we're in France in the 14th century, we're not going to be able to put pollen on it from the land of Jerusalem and have that be the only pollen spores that are there. I mean, you just start, I want to encourage our audience to just think through the implications of what you're saying. And this is why one British man has offered £1 million to anyone who can reproduce the Shroud of Turin in some kind of hoax-like
even with
fashion.
modern technology.
With modern technology. He said, here's £1 million sterling if you can reproduce the Shroud. Of course, no one can do it.
Yeah. A person doing a medieval forgery would never, you can't even imagine thinking of just the pollen. And there's a whole matrix of evidence we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely.
The pollen is very interesting. That's just a very tangible.
It's another layer of evidence.
Layer that you can discover. Okay. Now, speaking of science, there was carbon-14 dating that was done on the Shroud.
Correct.
In 1988. And this really kind of threw a major curveball into the whole thing for Shroud enthusiasts, for skeptics, and it's taken a long time to sort through this. So tell us about that and sort of the consequence of the carbon-14 test.
So this is really interesting, and this is where I've been infected with knowledge about the radiocarbon dating. In 1988, 3 different labs were able to do carbon-14 samplings, and as you've taught, anytime you do carbon-14 dating, it destroys the sample. And that raw data from that the British Museum had, they suppressed for 25 years. So even though they came out with their conclusions in 1988, the raw data took 25 years to be released. And it took a French attorney using the equivalent of a Freedom for Information Act in the UK to finally, 25 years later, get access to the raw data. And that's when the information came out that the Shroud has been repaired throughout history, okay? We know this. We also know the Shroud had been sold for relics, actually, in the past. If you gave a big enough gift to your local church, you might be able to get a piece of the Shroud sent to you. So we know there's been patches on the Shroud of Turin. Those are those triangular shapes that you can see on the Shroud. And guess what? Sample the labs tested in their carbon-14 dating, none other than the actual patchwork of the Shroud of Turin. So sure, we know it was absolutely repaired in the Middle Ages, but that's not the origination of the Shroud. There's a huge distinction there.
Sure.
And we learned that from the carbon-14 dating.
Now, in your research, did you get the sense that, now I don't like being a conspiracy theorist, was the sampling accidental? Or were they not thinking this through clearly to make sure they were taking from the original?
Now you're asking some really good questions,
Henry. And imputing motives is something we always want to be careful of. Right. But at the same time, there is methodological questions here. I've always wondered about that.
I have too.
What do you know about that?
I think it would be a great master's or PhD thesis for someone to look into those questions. Okay. Because those are the kind of questions that urgently need to be answered. And also, and I love the British Museum. I lead tours there. Me too. Why did they suppress the raw data for 25 years and not just release the raw data with the research? And so if we're going to follow the science as it relates to the Shroud of Turin, we need to be really careful that we're looking at the right sampling. And so what does radiocarbon test for? I mean, in layman's terms, carbon is smoke. Well, we know in the Middle Ages that the Shroud survived a fire. And what does the radiocarbon dating come back for? Oh, they said that the Shroud was about 700 years old. That's what they got.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, here's the analogy, and I know that, and I want to really roll into our next program. If I was able to stack all the evidence against the Shroud on this table and all the evidence for the Shroud on the table, the evidence for the Shroud would reach to the ceiling of your studio. The evidence against the authenticity of the Shroud would be one source, the radiocarbon dating. And that radiocarbon dating has been shown, and hear me clearly, to be totally erroneous. And so as you're weighing the evidence, like me, what has the most explanatory power? And I believe it's the authenticity of the Shroud, because the carbon-14 dating has been shown to be totally inauthentic.
Yeah, it's a shame because it is a good tool too. We use it in archaeology going back, you get back to the time of David, 1000 BC, a little bit before that, and then there's other issues that are unrelated to the shroud. It's really a shame that this happened this way, whether it happened deliberately or incompetence, we don't know. Somebody out there can do a research project to try to track that down. The time is getting on with this. Has there been any attempt to try to get a carbon-14 sample from a part of the shroud that we know is original?
Yeah, this is
Has anybody tried to do that?
We need somebody that knows the Pope really well, Henry, because the only time the shroud has ever been, the samplings were taken in 1978. So the shroud, the scholars only had about 60 hours that weekend.
Yeah.
All their equipment was held up in customs. So there's quite a story just in, this is where archaeology and doing this kind of show is just fun to hear the background and the context of. So we're blessed with a lot to have the shroud, but we need the Pope to give us another go at it.
So the forensic, the collection of it, based on what you understand it, and I've understood this for a long time too, is simply that it's the wrong spot, and it's through this giant monkey wrench, and of course misinformation out in the public now. Everybody thinks, this thing's from the medieval period. It's a forgery. It really killed. It really hurt getting to the truth. Is what I hear you about.
That's where I want to let people know we have breaking news until a very recent study that just came out a few months ago that's throwing the whole new light on the dating of the shroud.
All right. Friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back after this break.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin. Okay, now in our last segment, we talked about the what turned out to be the erroneous carbon-14 date that put the Shroud of Turin in the medieval period, and we talked about why that was incorrect. Now, you have some breaking news about another dating methodology that points in a much different direction. Tell us about that.
And this is breaking news right here on Digging for Truth, that a brand new research study has been published by the Heritage Journal, a very respected scientific journal, stating, based on WAXIS imaging, this is wide angle spectral imaging, WAXIS, that's the acronym for it, based on shroud fibers, it dates to 2,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a minute. This is from the Institute of Crystallography in Italy, and it compares with fibers found from a similar sample during the siege of Masada, which AD 70. It puts us in that right first century area, historically speaking. And so anyone who wants to, and in fact, I'm showing images right now of the journal itself, the X-ray dating of a Turin shroud's linen sample, where these authorities make it very clear that this dating shows that the shroud has been decomposing, as it were, for 2,000 years. That's essentially what the fibers are showing. It has been decomposing for the last 2,000 years, not 700 years, for the last 2,000 years. This is breaking news because it's a new, exciting way for us to know, like you do at ABR and all of your digs, you understand that we can harness technology to date fragments or previously undated artifacts.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And this Heritage Science Journal is not a Christian publication.
No, it's not. No.
If anything, it's a total. This is another one of these convergences of the scientific research you mentioned in the first episode. Again, a multidisciplinary approach to this. Again, the more you do that, the more you can take the bias out, any potential bias from trying to establish it. So now Masada, tell folks about that just a wee bit so they can connect.
Absolutely.
What happened at Masada and this cloth and that kind of thing.
So the first revolt of the Jews, AD 66 to 70, ended with a mass suicide at Masada. And this is where the Jewish term, even in the modern state of Israel, never again actually comes to originate. The Romans under Titus took over the land of Israel. They quashed this Jewish revolt, crucified so many Jews along the way, left their bodies hanging to absolutely to raise Jewish sensitivities, because if you know anything about Jewish burial traditions, you were buried on the day of your death. Even crucified criminals were, except in wartime during this Jewish revolt in AD 66 to 70. And so shrouds would have been plentiful in that time. And this wide-angle X-ray imaging, this Waxis characterization, shows very distinctly that these fibers match fibers from other linen shrouds from the land of Israel in the first century. This is why it's breaking news. And it really helps us think that, man, and this is where I so appreciate the work of Associates of Biblical Research and the work that you do, Henry. And I know that you did this with the Ebal curse tablet as well. This exciting way that we can evaluate fragments using technology that God's blessed us with for His glory in biblical archaeology.
Yeah, and it's remarkable too, because most of these things are developed by people who are not Christians.
Exactly.
So in the great cultural mandate that God gives in Genesis for man to subdue the earth, we can't help ourselves but do that. And then God uses those discoveries for the glory of His Son.
That's
and for the advancement of the church, right? And so we're able to benefit from that broad blessing that God gives all of mankind.
Exactly.
You know, it's really remarkable. So another dimension of this that I've seen you talk about that's really important is some of this like 3D imagery.
Yes.
Of the Shroud of Turin. Okay,
Yes.
so on the surface of it, you know, you have what would be a flat surface, and you've got this image of this man, right?
Right.
But if it was painted on there, it would be flat.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. We've already established it's not painted. But if you were making that argument for the sake, tell us about the 3D dimension of this, because this really fascinated me when I saw you in some other interviews on this.
Yeah, so this is what caused the entire Shroud of Turin research project to happen. These weapons scientists had in the 1970s a computer called a VP8 image analyzer. In fact, I'm showing you a picture of it on your screen right now. This is the VP8 image analyzer.
Looks like something they use for NASA.
Oh, it does.
The moon,
these
right?
weapons scientists have it. And they put a picture of their grandchildren through the VP8 image analyzer. And as you can see, it's just kind of a muddy image. It's not very clear because it's a photograph, and this is what they would expect from any photograph, except when they put the image of the crucified man in, check out what they began to see. There is literally a topography to the enhancement of the image. There's a 3D quality of the shroud image that this VP8 image analyzer picked up. And this blew their minds as weapons scientists. And so what you're seeing right now is the reason that those 50 scientists went to Italy to study the Shroud of Turin. It's important for people to understand the chronology. The VP8 image analyzer is what spawned the rest of the research because no photograph does this. So again, if it's a forgery, if it's a hoax, if it's just some weird picture from even that they could come up with, however that happened in the Middle Ages, it would not do this on their VP8 image analyzer. Another interesting way of looking at it is this photo right here. You can see that there's like a 3D quality to this. There's a topography to this image, and that's what's captivated it. So the VP8 image analyzer revealed that the image in the shroud is a three-dimensional topographic quality. And I think that's something that we all need to look at again and again when we study the Shroud of Turin, and what specifically gave the motivation to study this at a deeper level. Yeah.
It's really fascinating. There's just, I mean, imagine even in the modern day, you would have trouble creating something like this without an actual body, right?
Exactly.
Because of the way it's overlaid over the face of the person,
right?
In the shroud, like impossible to
totally
duplicate
impossible.
that.
Yeah.
So it really kind of again goes back to the Occam's razor idea of like all the other possibilities are eliminated.
Right.
Even if it seems unlikely to you as a non-Christian, right? The answer we're saying is not unlikely because the gospel tells us. But here we're talking about pointing at what they think is the unlikely answer.
And also, at what point do we reach beyond a reasonable doubt for something's authenticity? We'll never have certainty. We don't do history with the word certainty. We do it in probabilities. When do we know enough to believe something? When do we have enough evidence to make a decision? That's one of the key points.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We're doing really historiography, right?
Right.
Only
Exactly.
God has access to the events of the past.
Exactly.
We don't. We because
Yes.
they're past us. And so, at what point are you just being hyper skeptical?
Right.
And that's the point you're making. Well, friends, we're continuing our conversation about the Shroud of Turin. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here exploring the Shroud of Turin. Is it an authentic artifact? And is it the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, to help us answer that question, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is here with me. Someone who was once a shroud skeptic, not too long ago, my friend.
Very much so.
And you've come a long way. Here you are on Digging for Truth, sharing what you know as far as evidence goes. All right, so in our next two segments, we really want to go through some details on the shroud. I'm sure people are curious. We've talked more about some of the broader issues. A lot of intricate details of things that we can see in the shroud. And so we'll just tackle them one at a time, talk about them. I'll throw them out to you and you just kind of, run. I'll let you run with it.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe we'll start with the legs. Okay, what do we see on the shroud of the legs of this person and what do we see in the Gospels?
Well, crucifixion was a heinous way to die, and it normally took 2 or 3 days for a crucified victim to actually become deceased, to die. If you look at the juridical procedure of Jesus, Pilate is surprised that Jesus was so soon dead. He's actually surprised that he was dead already. In fact, anyone who's read the execution account of Jesus knows that the Roman centurions, they go to break the legs of Jesus as they would do with any other crucified criminal, and they see that Jesus has already died. He expires in about 6 hours on the cross. The crucifixion begins at 9 a.m. By 3 p.m. local time, Jesus gives up his body, his spirit, and he says it's finished. It's at that point that the execution experts approach the cross, and they don't need to break his legs. And so what do we see? Well, that exhibits verisimilitude with what we see of the crucified man in the Shroud of Turin. The legs are indeed not broken. In fact, I want to show a fascinating image right now because some individuals have pointed out all of the lacerations on the man of the shroud. I've actually updated this research. I used to say that there was around 372 wounds or lacerations on the man of the shroud. I've actually updated my research since, and now I count 700 wounds. What does that mean? Well, during Roman flagellation, we know that the flagrum that was used, the whip, had 3 quarts followed by lead barbells at the very end. It would not only whip your skin, but it would actually dig in and pull out flesh. It was a heinous way to die. We know in Hebrew law, Jewish law, you could only be whipped 40 times or 39 times to make sure you didn't hit 40.
Apostle Paul mentions that.
Exactly. Yeah. The Romans had no such law. And if you counted up the crucified man in the Shroud of Turin, Henry, if you can imagine, 120 lacerations, which produces 700 wounds on the crucified man. Not only are his legs not broken, Henry, there is a lance wound on the left side coming up to his heart. What other crucified man was crucified with a spear wound, a lance wound that's about 3.5 inches wide? We know that's Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, so let's stay with the lacerations for just a brief moment. As we reflect upon that, we think about, the wrath of God, the turning away of the Father from Jesus. And of course, we always talk about, when we talk about crucifixion, how horrible it was. But when we're talking about this many wounds on the only innocent person to ever live, it really should make us reflect personally.
Absolutely.
For the moment of what Jesus endured to free us from the bondage of sin.
Paul wrote in Romans 5:8, but God demonstrated his love for us, and that while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. When you think of the demonstration of the love of God, some of us, we wonder, does God really love me? Yeah. Have I sinned too much? Certainly God's turned his back on me. Every time you think those lies, all you have to do is look at the cross, look at the crucified man in the Shroud of Turin, and let that verse ring in your minds that God demonstrated his love for me. He went to the cross, he paid for my sin on the cross, and he gloriously resurrected 3 days later, that for all who place their trust in Christ, they're forgiven immediately, not because their sin wasn't serious, but because God dealt with our sin in our place on the cross. Yeah. And then you think of Ephesians 1:7, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sin. And the shroud is caked, and there are pints and pints and pints of human blood on the Shroud of Turin, blood that was shed likely, if it is Jesus, and I think it is, for you and me.
Yeah, that's remarkable. When I heard you doing some of your research, the number of lacerations, I was not aware of that before. It really stopped me dead in my tracks. Just to reflect on that. Some other aspects of this too, Jeremiah, that was beautiful, by the way.
Praise the Lord.
Thank you for that. The forehead. Yes. We have two phenomena. It looks like a pretty serious wound, and also other wounds on the head.
Right.
I'm sure our audience knows where we're going with this, but please share.
Well, I keep coming back to the fact that the way the crucified man, the image appears, there was only one person in history who was crucified that way. Out of all of the crucified remains that we have from antiquity, we have them in Italy, Britannia, we have them, of course, in the Holy Land, the land of Israel. We know of only one crucified victim that the historical records say a crown of thorns was placed on the crucified victim's head, and that was Jesus of Nazareth. And I want to correct our audience, who oftentimes we see the image like it's almost like a sweatband, just a little crown of thorns kind of neatly placed, almost like a wreath around his head. No, this was a helmet of thorns, and I'm showing our audience right now this very image that you can actually see at Notre Dame in the land of Israel. You can see this image of what the helmet of thorns would have looked like. And that's consistent with the evidence that we have of the crucified man of the shroud. There are penetrations all over his head, not just the forehead, blood all over the head, all over the scalp, wounds, impressions made by those thorns. We also say that the crucified man, his nose is broken. I want to be careful. I know that there's not an actual bone in our nose, but what I mean by that, the ligaments have been loosened from his nose being punched so many times. The nose is off center. There's a humongous gash in his forehead. He was unrecognizable because of all that he endured at the hands of the executioners.
Yeah, and you can see that. I mean, you can see that in these images. It's right. So it's all one by one pointing us. How do you? First of all, you can't forge it. All the evidence that you've talked about, and then how does it? The verisimilitude, one of our favorite words, right? But how does it synchronize with the biblical text? Now, let's talk about blood a little bit.
Okay.
So a couple things. One is. Some have said, well, blood typically after a while will turn black. Okay.
Yeah.
But in this case, we don't quite have that with the shroud, and there's scientific explanation behind that. So tell us about that.
Dr. Alan Adler did a heavyweight hematological study of the blood of the shroud, and he pointed out that when a crucified individual is enduring trauma, or when any individual is enduring trauma, the liver will excrete bilirubin, which causes the blood to actually stay red. Because if you look at normal blood that's not undergone trauma, it doesn't have that secreted bilirubin that a crucified victim or a trauma victim would have. And that's why the blood stayed red on the Shroud of Turin, which again is consistent with the trauma of a crucified individual.
Yeah, it's another. It just stands out to me so much when you think about that, and Jesus' full humanity, as well. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be back after this break. ABR is excited to announce the publication of Volume 2 from our excavations at Khirbet el-Maqadir. The volume details archaeological remains from about 350 BC to the 8th century. This includes a New Testament village that may have been visited by Jesus. Over 400 pages of analysis, photos, and maps. You can pick up a copy today by visiting BibleArchaeology.org. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. We're talking about the Shroud of Turin with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. Okay, we've been talking about specific evidence on the shroud. The last one was the bilirubin, which kept the blood red, studied by scientists, clearly a trauma victim, right, which is obviously consistent with crucifixion. Another one, so one is we have the bruised cheek and shoulder abrasions. So let's talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, according to Roman crucifixion, the crucified victim, after experiencing the flagellation, the whipping, would be required to carry the patibulum, the crossbeam of the cross, and that probably weighed, Henry, we estimate around 70 or 80 pounds. And Jesus, or the crucified man in the shroud, of course we know Jesus was asked to carry the cross. He couldn't, so we know Simon of Cyrene picked it up. This is familiar to those of you that have read the Passion accounts. What do we see reflected in the evidence from the image of the crucified man of the shroud? We see that there are extra abrasions on the shoulder of the crucified victim. Again, consistent with what we know of Jesus. And back to the blood, Henry, I want to share a breaking news article because we're going through all these, we're doing a lightning round here. We're going through all, and I want to make sure your audience knows, at the time that we're recording this broadcast, not even 3 months ago, a brand new hematological report was released on the blood studies of the Shroud of Turin, and it's titled New Insights on Blood Evidence, and you're seeing this from the Turin Shroud, consistent with Jesus Christ's tortures. Now, this is a hematological study. Now, unfortunately, I know a lot about this because my dad just nearly lost his life by battling cancer. And so when I read that this crucified victim had skyrocketing levels of ferritin in the blood, I know that the crucified man was experiencing organ failure. I also know that because that's what my dad was experiencing in a hospital in Houston. He had high levels of creatinine, again, consistent with trauma. Low levels are lowering oxygen, meaning the crucified victim was slowly suffocating. The blood was beginning to not circulate as quickly. All of that has just come out in this hematological report, which again is consistent with the trauma endured by Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable, these correlations. I mean, and again, the scientific aspect of it, you can't, it's not a worldview issue.
You don't need faith for this. These are scientific reports.
Scientific reports. A couple of other items.
Yes.
We're just going to keep going. We're going to keep going. We got a few more minutes left here. One of the things that's always interesting to me, you mentioned the pollen already, but flowers.
Yes.
Let's talk about the flower imagery on the shroud. What do you know about that?
Well, these are, again, this flower imagery is consistent with plant life, with what we know from the land of Israel. And again, if you and I were coming up with a hoax, we just wouldn't know that, Henry, in the Middle Ages. We wouldn't know that in the 14th century. We would have, if you and I were coming up with a hoax, Henry, we would have come out with a Jesus that was barely bearded, a more effeminate looking Jesus, certainly not a Jesus that was nearly 6 foot tall. We never would have guessed those things because biblical archaeology, as you know in this show, is a relatively young discipline. It's been around at best for 200 years. Again, those of you that are watching today and you're blessed by this program led by Henry Smith, you know how valuable it is for us as Christians. We know more about our faith than Augustine, than Charles Spurgeon. We know more about our faith than some of the great thinkers of the past because of the blessing of biblical archaeology. And so I believe to whom much is given, much is required. We're blessed with this embarrassment of riches, this embarrassment of detail, thanks to the material culture. And this should help us first to read our Bibles more faithfully, interpret the scripture with more precision, and spread the gospel with more passion.
Yeah, God has been really good to us. I always say His word is sufficient. He doesn't need to do all of this for people, and yet He does. He gives all this evidence. Okay, a couple more items as we come down towards the end. Coins on the eyes.
Yes. Again,
what do we know about that?
This is very recent. I was reading another peer-reviewed study recently about all of the numismatics, the study of coinage. I love that word. My wife thinks I'm a dork because she walks in and sees me studying coins. I'm a coin dude. I just love it. I have a collection of them.
That's great.
And this is, again, we're seeing more and more in biblical scholarship that Jews love to bury their loved ones with coins. They thought it was similar to being buried with with crucifixion nails as well. Many of our audience may not be aware that crucifixion nails were almost seen like a rabbit's foot or a good luck charm. I mean, Jews of the first century were very superstitious, Henry, and so we see that also reflected in the burial of the man of the shroud.
Yeah, so the coins on the eyes, right? Is where they put them. All right, so speaking of the nails, about 30 seconds on the nails. Do we see evidence of that?
Yes, we do. And in fact, we see very accurate evidence because the nails are driven through not the palm, but through the wrists of the crucified man. And of course, you Greek scholars out there, you know it's the same Greek word for palm or wrist. And we see that those wounds are consistent with what we know of crucified victims, certainly with Jesus. We also see the nail impressions from the feet as well.
Excellent. Well, it's just been unbelievable to walk on this journey with you, Jeremiah. I really appreciate your being here. We'll be airing the show after you're coming to the ABR annual fundraising banquet and sharing a great message there. And we want to thank you for doing that and getting together in person. It's been a long time coming. But I'm so grateful for your open-mindedness on this question. You've convinced me more than I was convinced before. That's
hard
for sure.
to do. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you, and thank you for all you do at Digging for Truth, too.
Thank you. Appreciate it, brother. Well, friends, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll consider the evidence that Dr. Johnston laid out for us. I'm reminded of two things today. He shared about his father's illness, very serious to the point of death. My own family recently experienced a tragedy, a death in the family. And as I sat at the memorial service, I realized that no worldview, no philosophy has the answer to the problem of death except for Christianity.
Amen.
That Jesus of Nazareth gave his life to save sinners. We see evidence of that in the Shroud of Turin, which I am personally largely convinced that this is actually the burial shroud. But even if somehow this is not, the truth of the matter is that Jesus died for our sins, and you can come to know him today, and we hope that you do so. Thank you for watching our show and for supporting the ministry of ABR.